love that line. Vengeance is a lazy form of
It does make you think, though. I mean, if you were family,
right?
I mean, you worry your loved one, and you want justice. But it meant you were going to mourn the rest of their life and never.
God bless you.
Yeah, not easy for sure. But that's kind of the topic for tonight, and where we're going to go. I thought I would start us just tonight with like a reminder of where we've been. And I was talking with Will actually this morning as I've been doing the study. One of the things about this book that has just been super impressive to me, which I would not have guessed as I've studied it, has been just the literary structure. Sounds kind of like nerdy, but it's just like a really well written, really well put together book that forces you. It's kind of like written in we'll get into this in this chapter, but it's like one of those movies where you have the aha moment at the end, right? And then you have to go back and watch the movie all over again with this brand new perspective, right? In many ways, we can look at chapter 4, and it forces us to go back and reread. Anybody seen the movie, The Book of Eli?
Yeah.
Right? So I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. But that's one of those movies where it ends, and you're like, oh, I need to go back and watch this whole movie now with this brand new perspective, right? So here's just a reminder of where we've been in the literary structure, right? So Jonah's broken down into 4 different scenes. Scene 1 is Jonah and the sailors, and you see each of these chapters has a chiastic structure, and is written intentionally with ways that mirror each other, and so there's different literary patterns that happen, but then also the chapters relate to each other, right? So this is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, and we looked at the contrast of how these mirrored each other with the going down, and they both end with the sacrifice and the vows. So we have this connection between 1 and 2, but then we also have a connection between 1 and 3 and 1 and 4. And so last week we looked at how the connection was. There's this parallel between the call to rise for Jonah, and then his reluctance. And then here we have the sailors perishing and the Ninevites perishing. And then tonight we'll kind of look at 2 and 4, how those parallel, where in both of 2 and 4 Jonah prays, right? And then Jonah has a response as well. So it's one of those books that is really, really well written. In fact, tonight we'll look at the fact that the structure for chapter 4, the beginning and the end have a speech. The first one is Jonah's speech, and it's 39 words in Hebrew. And then it ends with God's speech, which is 39 words in Hebrew. Probably not an accident, right? I mean, this book was written with great intention, and it's a beautiful literary work. So, with that said, anybody want to read? Let's pop over to scene 4. Anybody want to read scene 4 for us tonight? Yeah, sweet. Okay.
Jonah's anger at the Lord's compassion. But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen in the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about that plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry, I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, that you did not tend it to make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?"
I love that you committed to the part. That's
Right.
fantastic. I love it.
All right. Yeah, right? Yeah, this is-
I'm waiting to read that, haven't you?
This is one of those books.
Volunteered, it's like read the last
So
one.
the word, the last word of the book is actually, that is translated animals there, is cattle or cows, right? So it's like, and many cows.
You mean that-
And it's like this
and all
mic
cows.
drop moment, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just like, and then like there's nothing, we don't get any response from Jonah, like the story just ends, right?
Do you
The
want
author
to hear
put
more
this
from him?
tremendous amount of thought into this whole book and ended it. That was like he was
But he
like,
sounds like a
I'm tired,
rat.
I'm
I
done.
want to hear from him.
Yeah. And we're left like with all sorts of questions hanging, right? Okay, so initial observations from this chapter. What are some things that stick out?
That he was provided these by God, and he was partaking in them, I guess, but then he wasn't tending to things around him.
Okay, so God provides. Has that been a constant theme in Jonah?
Yeah.
Right? Where else has God provided in Jonah?
Takes him out of the Sheol and provides salvation for him.
Okay, so he provides with a fish. What else?
Provides relief from the storm.
Good. Calms the sea.
What about when he was, oh yeah, he said that right, the vomit from the fish.
He provided a way back to live up to what the Lord had asked for them
Okay.
to get back to Nineveh.
We talked about how bad the Assyrians were, right? I mean, God provided protection for Jonah to walk into a city like that, right? And we hear nothing of him being ridiculed or attacked or beat up or any of that kind of stuff.
But he only walked one day.
Right.
What would have happened if he walked the other two?
Well, it only-
What could have happened?
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
What else? What other things stick out in this
What
chapter?
sticks out to me is he was just so certain in his own judgment of what should have happened to them. Why, as a prophet, wouldn't he be excited that 120,000 people and the cattle turned towards God?
Right.
Is that
So
the whole point? Is that their existence?
so Jonah is angry at his success. Right?
He wanted his own justice and not the tree of life justice that God was looking for.
He
God
has
also
this.
provided a vine for shade.
What's that?
He provided a vine for a leaf for shade.
Was
Yeah.
that like a big elephant leaf? That's what I'm
He took water into his mouth.
Yeah. Well, and you guys are laughing. So obviously at this point, we're understanding that there are all sorts of ironic moments within this book, right? That the author is intending for us to laugh at the comedy of some of this stuff.
I mean, this is where you get the whole why did he run away, right? We had all of our
Right.
guesses, but you don't know until he actually just says it and then just lays it all out. This is why I ran from you. This is the whole thing. I don't want this to happen.
Right.
I think that's interesting. And also, we in 3 it says that God relented from his anger. And then we start 4 and it's like, then Jonah got angry. And so it's like one stops and the other one picks up.
Right.
That was kind of interesting.
He sounds so ungrateful to me, like a child.
Because we need-
Like he's been provided so much.
Right.
I can see him like stomping his feet. It's better for me to die than to live. Like this is ridiculous.
Right.
This isn't how
Yeah.
I saw it. So just kill me. This is so stupid. It just sounds
Took
like
my
a
leaf away
teenager.
from him.
You're
Right.
ruining my life.
Like multiple times saying the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, he's like a little kid that walks into a gas station with his parent and just starts throwing a fit, right? Yeah. But like that's what we've come to expect, right? I mean, we should full blown expect this reaction and behavior by like Jonah is running in chapter 1. You know, he seems like grateful, thankful in chapter 2, but it really comes off as pride. And then he gives this 5-word sermon with no mention of God or mercy, and it's kind of like this 40 days doom and gloom destruction type of thing, right? Yeah. What? Anything else stick out?
I like how God is like really patient with him. Like the whole kind of time, he's just like making things happen to get him there. And then even here, like Jonah uses God's own reputation against him. He's yelling at him for being kind and compassionate and gracious.
Yeah.
And then God's response is, have you good reason to be angry? And Jonah doesn't even answer. He just walks off.
Yeah.
I'll go sit out here.
It's interesting that God responds in questions instead of statements.
Yeah.
Right? He's engaging in the relationship and probing and allowing for Jonah to do the self-discovery. Similar to the way we see him engaging with Adam and Eve, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. Where are you?
Yeah, where are you? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of how it's similar to how we relate with like a toddler, right? Where it's like, when God says, "Where are you?" like the implication is that he obviously knows the answer to that question, but he's in like, and God knows the answers to the questions that he's asking Jonah, but he's allowing Jonah to kind of go on this path of self-discovery. So you had mentioned the reason, right? This is, pun intended, the anchor of the entire book, that verse, right? So his reason is what? What reason does he give?
Doesn't want God to forgive him.
Right. And so do you remember back in chapter 1 when Jonah was on the boat and we had this kind of authorial like aside where the author was like, oh, and by the way, he had told them that like who his God was. I think it was, I can't remember which verse it was, but we had like this kind of like parentheses author moment where the author kind of breaks the fourth wall. Do you guys remember that? Yeah. This is kind of one of those same things. So how, like, given this rationale, how does this change the way, or how does this help us interpret chapter 1 with the sailors?
It's like a secret, a key to reading a cipher or something, like a, you know what I mean? Like it's like watching The Sixth Sense and then realizing he was dead the whole time. Or,
Oh my God, he was dead?
well, no! I ruined it again. But yeah, you reread the whole story differently.
Right.
And you start seeing all he meant it like that.
Right.
Especially in the prayer. The prayer is usually where everyone gets like, oh, he's good. And then read it through this lens and it's like, oh, he's not good.
So he says, I knew that you were gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in mercy, and one who relents of disaster. Where do we see that in chapter 1?
It said storm, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, we talked about like Jonah being kind of upside down world, right? Who are the ones that offer Jonah grace and compassion in chapter 1? The sailors, right? So it's like the sailors are taking on that characteristic of God. And then God sends the fish to be that vehicle, right? And then the Ninevites accept that God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And here we have him knowing God's character full well and saying, like, I want to run from that, right? Okay, so let's back up. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. A couple of questions we can ask. I just popped in here. There's more, but why is Jonah so angry with God's character? You would think that he would want to embrace that. Why does Jonah still wish to die? Jonah has kind of had an ongoing death wish throughout the book, right? And it seems like he kind of turns the corner at the end of chapter 2, but we're right back there again, right? Like he's like, we're not on the boat, but he's still wishing to die. And then we'll look at some of God's object lesson. The two characters in this chapter are God and Jonah, and so we really get into like furthering the character development of these two. And so what we learn is that from God's characters, he's gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And we've seen that Jonah's character, he's angry, he's bitter, he's disobedient, he's suicidal, he hates his enemies. Okay? And we're meant to, again, contrast Jonah's prayer. Remember, because in chapter 2, it was kind of questionable of like, where is Jonah at? It seems like he's heading in the right direction. Maybe he's repented. Maybe he's actually like getting it with his response, right? And that's been kind of that theme as well that we've held in tension throughout the book is actions and words. And so the author is presenting that to us and saying like, hey, is this person a hypocrite, or are their words matching their actions? Okay. This is the structure of the text. Again, we have 39 words that are in Jonah's and God's speech. Jonah and God dialogue with one another in the B sections. In the C sections, Jonah provides his own shelter from the sun, and then that's taken away. And then in D, Jonah provides shelter, or God provides shelter, and then God ruins the shelter. So let's go back up to verse 1. And verse 1 says, "But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry." What have we seen about Jonah's kind of emotional state throughout the book?
Volatile.
Okay.
Very self-focused.
Okay.
Extreme.
Extreme. Yeah. So the Hebrew word here for anger occurs in 4:1, and then it also occurs in 4:4. If you look down, it says, "But the Lord said, 'Do you have a good reason to be angry?'" This word actually means like hot with anger or heat anger, and it first occurs in, anybody want to guess?
Wait.
First occurrence in the Bible? Where do we see?
Genesis? Is that where he finds out the sin?
Cain and Abel.
There we go. Spot on. Yeah. Cain and Abel. So it first occurs with Cain and Abel, and Cain is it says he is hot with anger against his brother, and God comes and questions Cain. Same thing. He says, "Cain, why are you hot with anger? Your sin is crouching at your door, and you should be a master over it." Right? And we can understand, like, when we get angry, we heat up, right? I mean, we understand that metaphor, like, we get hot with anger. And part of what this is a callback to is what happens when people, like, the writer is drawing us back to the Cain and Abel story, right? Which is the beginning of like, the hot anger in the Bible. So what happens with Cain and Abel? Cain kills his brother because he's hot with anger. And then later we have this guy named Lamech, who is a descendant of Cain that ends up killing. And then from then on, the killing and the heat anger just begins to multiply and build like the snowball rolling downhill, right? So then we have the establishment of Babylon, and then we have Egypt, and then now we're here in Nineveh, and eventually it's going to be Rome with Jesus, right? So the author is reminding us that like this heat anger that started with Cain and Abel that had to do with killing our brothers is something that has gotten out of control, and it's the very thing that Jonah is running against, right? He has this heat anger for his enemies, and he desires their death. And God is saying, like, why are you hot with this anger? What is this? Why are you justified for that? So verse 2, please, Lord, was it not what I said when I was still in my own country? Therefore, in anticipation of this, I fled to Tarshish, since I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in mercy, and one who relents from disaster. That phrase, or some combination of that phrase and those characteristics, is repeated over and over and over again in the Old Testament. And it's like the definitive characteristic of who God is in the Old Testament. Gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in mercy, and one who relents from disaster. Any guesses of where that first occurs?
I want to say Exodus.
Yep, Exodus. It actually occurs, God gives this definition to Moses on Mount Sinai. It says, then the Lord passed by in front of Moses and proclaimed, the Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. So God defines himself as that. We see it again in Nehemiah. It says, they refused to listen, and they did not remember your wondrous deeds, which you had performed among them. So they became stubborn and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God of forgiveness, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. And you did not forsake them. Again in Joel, it says, and rend your heart and not your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, loving kindness, and relenting from evil. Sound like Jesus at all? Yeah? So verse 3 says, So now, Lord, please take my life for me, for my death is better to me than life. Thoughts on that? Jonah's death wish, that he would rather die than see his enemies converted.
Like my verse says, if you won't kill them, kill me. I'm better off dead. I feel like he doesn't want to go back and face them and look stupid for telling them, well, you're all going to die. And then they didn't.
Right.
I don't know.
We had speculated that he might have been afraid of death. That's why he ran from the city.
Right.
But in fact, he's like, please just kill me if you're not going to destroy them. So that's sort of the opposite. I also noted that in my translation for life, it says the word is soul, which I feel like might be a total side subject, but
Yeah.
maybe it's something that you kind of know about.
It would be nefesh.
Yeah.
Soul would be a bad translation of that.
Yeah, no, it doesn't, but it says, but spirit, as in God breathes.
I can look.
Spirit. It says it's not the word for it. Translated as life, then it's like, just kidding, not actually that word.
What's the what are the coordinates? Jonah, what?
Oh,
4.
just lost it. Oh, 3. There's 4, 3, yeah.
Yeah, nefesh. Yeah, so it would be life.
You can see it, and you click on it, the first word that comes up is soul. That's probably what it's talking about. Number 1.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole. We can go down.
No, that's fine. I was just pointing it out. That might.
Oh, whoops, where'd I go now? Well, I can go back up here. Yeah. So, anybody been that angry before? Or want to admit that they have been? Yeah?
So I think with this whole book, I almost get this picture of when Nathan, the prophet Nathan, was talking to David and telling him this parable. David was getting pissed.
Yeah.
And Nathan said, "This is about you." And Jonah is very extreme in a lot of measures, but I can find myself in Jonah in just about all the different situations.
Yeah.
And so many times, even when God sends you, you run from him. Brings you to rock bottom, you relent. You go and do it, what God says. And God does his work, but it's still totally different than what you think it's going to be or what it should be. And Jonah didn't like these people. How many people that are different than me that I don't think deserve, but yet God is merciful and gracious, and he is chasing them.
Right.
And he wants me to be part of that. I just see myself in it over and over, and then it's very extreme, but
Yeah, 100%. We are meant to be the main subject in the story, to impose us into Jonah's position and say, "Oh yeah, I'm like that." I mean, that's what this book does. Is it's like, "Oh, by the way, you're the man." Right, like Nathan stated. Yeah. By the way, we're all Jonah.
You do all these silly things, like we look at our teenage kids that do this stuff,
right?
You know.
Yeah.
But yet God looks at me.
Yeah, and it's one thing to confess God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. It's another thing to go and proclaim that to people you really don't like.
That's what I mean. It's sort of a hard one for us in America right now, where we're kind of like, we've had a lot of safety and security for the most part compared to other countries. Like, if an Israeli went over to like the Palestinian side in the Gaza and was like, God loves you, I forgive you. If a Jewish person from the concentration camp said it to a Nazi, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If I was in Israel and 10 of the 12 tribes got wiped out and I experienced that and the horrors of that, then I might be in a very different situation on wanting God's forgiveness for them.
Yeah.
I don't know what that feels like. To challenge someone to be in a situation of tragedy and persecution and go and love your enemy.
Yeah, Jonah, in a sense, represents what it means to be Antichrist, right?
Yeah.
Because Jesus comes and he would rather die and allow his enemies to live and say, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they're doing," right? Yeah. And Jonah is the opposite. But, that's part of the point, is we all have the potential within us to be Antichrist in that way. And we're meant, like the book is meant to just as we're starting to feel good about ourselves and turn and walk away, it just kind of sticks the knife in and turns it. We're like, "Oh, right, I can do that." Yeah. I love how, God's response is, "Do you have a good reason to be angry?" Right? Like, just like that, just kind of that probing question, I mean, all of us here that are parents in the room have asked that question of our kids, right? When we've seen them get hot with anger over something. And we just kind of question their motives, why are you really angry? So, it says, "Then Jonah left the city and sat down east of it." Okay. There he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen to the city. So let's remind ourselves, Jonah was supposed to go in 3 days. He went in 1, right? And he preached in 40 days. This place is going to burn, right? And so now we have him going outside of the city and setting up camp. So, why is Jonah setting up camp at this point outside the city?
To watch the show.
To watch the fireworks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My guess is he's hoping to see what he wants to see.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah.
I think maybe too that he was a little bit afraid of being a false prophet, possibly in that he went down and told him, "You're going to die."
Right.
When it didn't happen, and he's getting angry, that hey, but he's forgetting that God's merciful, and the same mercy that he walked in, he wasn't willing at that time to give to his enemies.
Exactly.
Yeah, and he's setting up camp to watch the fireworks after he already knows, after the people have already repented. He's still expecting for that to happen. And after he's had this conversation with God of like, hey God, like this is why I didn't go, is because I knew you were gonna like. So even after God has like forgiven them, he's still setting up camp, going like, maybe there's a chance still, right? Which is, think about this. This is that's the response from both the sailors and from the king, right? I don't have the text in front of me, but in chapter 1, the sailors say something along the lines of like, who knows? Maybe God will turn and relent, right? And then the king says the exact same thing. And Jonah has the exact same, or kind of the exact same question, but like the different desire, right? Like he's not saying, who knows, maybe God will relent. He's saying like, who knows, maybe God will not relent and actually like, take care of business. So he's hopeful in the opposite way that he should be.
I was reading a commentary and I just kind of seen that, which was interesting. God sent him in here, and they pointed out that Jonah wanted an angry God because they're sinning over here. But God was mercy. But what the commentary kind of said, Jonah wanted a wrathful God during this whole time. And it's just amazing how God kind of comes in there and sends him on a mission, which he should be upset, but he's showing him love.
Yeah.
And compassion. And Jonah wanted wrath.
Which can be us, right? Good.
Do you think the East reference is a callback to Adam and Eve and they get kicked out of the garden?
Yep. It's another way of saying Jonah is going away from the presence of God. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we have the city, right? And Jonah goes out of it, and what does it say that he does?
Sat down to sulk. And made a makeshift shelter.
Okay, there we go. He makes a shelter, a tabernacle. Okay? Why does he do that? Does the text say?
Well, the Lord gave him the plant for shade, so I assume it was hot.
Right, so verse 5, we get it. There he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen to the city. Okay? So there's this interesting object lesson that God does here, right? Jonah provides his own shade, right? And then what does God do? Makes another shade, right? This can be our plant, but he he covers it even more. So the Lord designated a plant, and it grew up over Jonah to be a shade over his head, to relieve him from his discomfort. And Jonah was what? Overjoyed. That it's that, I think it's back to that Hebrew word, the kadal. He's great. So this is the first time in all of Jonah that we see a positive emotion out of him, right? And what is he, like, he's already got shade, but God provides on top of that an extra grace, abundance, right? And he's what? He's exceedingly happy. Over what? Over the shade. Okay? But then God, in his creativity and playfulness, but God designated a worm when dawn came the next day, and it attacked the plant, and it withered. So God provides the shade, and then takes it away. So at this point, Jonah's still got shade. I mean, he's got his own, but he just doesn't have the extra, right? And when the sun came up, God designated a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head, so that he had become faint, and he begged with all of his life to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." So he's back to, like, returning right back to verse 4, right? Grumbling and wanting to die. Right back to, being on the ship. But God said to Jonah, "Do you have a good reason to be angry about the plant?" So, same thing. See the repetition here of do you have a good reason to be angry back in verse 4? Do you have a reason to be angry about the plant? And he said, "I have a good reason to be angry, even to the point of death." Thoughts?
It reminds me of the Israelites in Exodus after they left Egypt and they're getting manna.
Right.
And they have quail and they're complaining when the water tastes bad.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
they just eat the same thing and they want to go back to Egypt because they had meat everywhere even though they were being treated so terribly. They just whine. And it can be one day removed from a miracle and they're whining again and grumbling.
Which, again, all of
It's
us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
When I have
How-
indoor plumbing and refrigerators and heating and everything else, and something happens at work, and
Yeah.
I come home and complain.
How quickly we forget, right? Yeah. That's a constant theme in the Old Testament of remember the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, who did this, who did this, who did this, right? Remember, remember, remember. Because we're so prone to just quickly forget, But you're 100% right. So on your other side of the page, this is a callback to Exodus 14. If we compare Jonah with the Israelites in Exodus 14, Jonah would rather die than serve his enemies because he truly understands God's character. The Israelites would rather serve their enemies than die because they lack faith in God's character. So look at Exodus 14, 11 through 12. And this has one of my favorite texts in the Bible. It says, "Then they said to Moses," so this is, the Israelites have already been, in the story, they've been taken out of Egypt, crossed through the Red Sea. They're now in the desert, but they're like, "Great, we're in the desert. Now what, Moses?" Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to the wilderness to die? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt?" Right? Same thing. Call back to the same thing that we get in Jonah. Saying, "Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." All right? You see the parallels in the text? Okay, so let's jump to, or any thoughts before we go to the final section, God's response?
I was just gonna say, I think it's really interesting that he responds, because he asks him, do you have good reason to be angry? And Jonah blows him off and goes outside to see what will happen. And then his answer is to do this plant thing. So he like creates a parable for him.
Right.
Instead of
a living parable.
talking to him.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting way to respond. And then follows up again. Do you have a right to be angry at the point?
Right.
So he gets another way of dealing with the issue.
I feel like that also displays what he says here too. It's
Yes. Yes.
So it reflects that back
He's
because
living.
he doesn't act in wrath. Like as a parent, I probably would if my kid
Right.
turned away,
Right.
right?
Right.
Does God ever give up on Jonah
No.
throughout this entire book? No. Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect object lesson of like, he's like, oh, you just said that this is what I was like. Let me demonstrate that to you again and again.
That's a great analogy. He never gives up on him, no matter how silly he's being.
Especially when you look at the character description you have to put on the slide, the long list of
Right.
Jonah. Kind of gives us hope.
A
that
subversive
we're maybe not
story
so bad.
of a rebellious prophet who hates God. For that one, or are you talking about?
Where you had God's character and Jonah's character.
Oh,
on the
okay.
slides.
Yeah, angry, bitter, disobedient, suicidal, enemy hating.
Yeah, he still kept chasing after him.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the final words. Then the Lord said, "You had compassion on the plant, for which you did not work, and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. Should I not also have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their right hand and their left, as well as many cows?" Mic drop. And it's almost kind of like it's like that parent-child moment where like God has the last word, and it's like what is Jonah even going to say to that? Right? Like he has no response.
You can't argue with that.
So look at what's the comparison and the contrast that God is making there?
Well, I like how it says it in the Message version. It says, "What is this? How is it you can change your feelings from pleasure to anger overnight about a mere shade tree that you did nothing to get? You neither planted nor watered it. It grew up one night and died the next. So why can't I likewise change what I feel about Nineveh from anger to pleasure? This big city of more than 120,000 childlike people who don't yet know right from wrong, to say nothing of all the innocent animals." And so, yeah, if you can change your mind like that and it should be okay with God, why can't God then do the same for a positive outcome?
So we're meant to contrast this exceeding anger for his enemies with his exceeding joy for the plant. Right? And it's almost like we talked about like how it's a satire and everything is upside down, right? And it's kind of everything is over the top. It's like you have all this joy for a plant that comes up and one day withers and dies the next, but you're not going to let me save these people. 11 says, "Should I not also have compassion on Nineveh, the great city?" Remember, that theme has been over and over and over again about the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their right hand and their left. So the two, we talked about this last week, and I've looked into it a little bit. This idea of the difference between their right hand and their left. Some commentators think that is a way of saying children. So it would be saying the innocent, and if that's the case, then scholars have estimated that that 120,000 is meant to be the children. So the city would be closer to like 6, 7, 8, 900,000 people, which probably just from like historical information that we have is probably not true. I think what it more likely means, and some other commentators have pointed to, is this idea of not knowing your right hand from your left and not knowing what direction to go. So this is a theme in the Old Testament. This is on the bottom of one of your side of your pages. In the Old Testament, the Torah teaches the Israelites moral discernment. This is how they know how to take a straight path, not turning to the right or to the left, knowing good from evil. So Deuteronomy says, "You shall not turn aside to your right or to your left. You shall walk in all the way which the Lord God has commanded you, that you may live that it may be good with you, and that you may live long days in the land which you possess." And this repeated kind of left and right theme is also in Deuteronomy and a couple places in Joshua as well. But it's this idea, right, that we saw in chapter 3 of the Ninevites they're kind of like lost. They're not walking the center path of God, right? And so not knowing their right hand from their left is a way of saying they don't know how to follow God or which direction to go. And I care for them because they're lost sheep, right? I mean, and so that's kind of the point that I think that the author is making there. And then he says, as well as many cows. Thoughts on the ending? If you were the author, how would you have ended it? Like that, or something else?
Probably wouldn't have thought of that. The end.
How does that leave you as someone who's reading it, as the audience? Like, how does that leave us?
I feel better that the animals don't have to fast anymore.
Or put on sackcloth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think typically when I hear animals versus cows, because cows or cattle, I think would be on the same level as money. Like that's their livelihood,
Yeah.
right? Their cattle or their sheep or things like that. Versus when I see animals, I think like, oh, they're dogs and cats or whatever, I don't know. But when I hear like cattle, to me that means money. So I don't know if there's some tie to that. And then I'm also thinking about religions that worship cows,
Oh yeah.
which I don't know, it just makes my mind wander. I don't know if there's any significance to that.
Maybe it was a Denver emphasis.
What
Right.
did you say?
Denver emphasis. So like,
But there's just so much life there.
yeah, it's just
Not
like,
just
almost like kind of like putting an exclamation mark on it.
Right.
Like it's not just people, it's the animals too.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
Yeah, there's almost kind of like a hierarchy, right? Like Jonah cares about like the lowest substratum of life, the plants, right? And God's like, hey, look, like I care about the people and the animals.
Mhm.
Not that he
Yeah,
doesn't
it was
care
like-
about.
you said, the Minecraft is kind of like 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals. You know, like so it's like not just the people; it's this entity also. You know,
Right.
I just kind of like kind of tries emphasizing that to make a statement.
Yeah.
That is funny.
Was
That's funny.
makes you want to look at the other page.
Where's the
Right.
rest?
Yeah.
Where's the rest?
Yeah, you're
Here's
left
God
like
talking, or you
Yeah.
know, the author is writing. This is what God is saying.
Yeah.
We talked last week too about the idea that in cases like on the conquest, where everything has to be wiped out, and it specifically mentions the animals too, right?
The city is treated as
Some kind of corporate feeling of like, well, those are the Ninevites' animals. They're somehow corporately thought of as part of the Ninevite people, and so they're all lumped together in their mind.
yeah, that could be part of it.
Which I can't think that way, but yeah.
So let me ask, I think in this chapter, we see kind of three things that we've already seen that kind of point us back to some stuff. So we see the reason, right, why Jonah has run. We see his repeated death wish, and we see once again God's mercy. So how do these three kind of echo back into the previous chapters? How do we reread those chapters now in light of that? Anything stick out as we kind of take those ideas backwards?
I think I kind of related back to what I was saying before. If I look at it from Jonah being me, but I run from that and put myself in that situation. It kind of changes things. Times in my life, I can find times in my life when I'm family.
I think we see the, proto-Ninevites, if you want to call them that, and the sailors, and they're pagans, and they, believe in God and trust Him, and God shows them mercy, ends the storm, forgives them. They become converted, connected people, which might mean they know now their right hand from their left. You see Jonah just wishing to die in the ocean there. We see his prayer, which he talks about people who worship idols can't have God's compassion in his prayer. Right? You in your temple, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, where I'll go to worship you eventually and give you sacrifices. And all the other idol worshipers, they don't have anything to do with you or your compassion, which is the opposite of the whole story. And now we see as we read the Ninevites, we see, God again showing up and showing compassion, and seems to imply like it's going to be even more, right? Because, okay, he didn't kill them all, but they don't know their right hand from their left. So it feels like there's more to be done.
Right. The book ends with unfinished business.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
And Jonah's always so quick to point out how wrong everyone else is, but never once sees himself as being in the wrong.
No, we're never like that.
The idol worshippers,
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I just think too, who's the Nineveh today? I mean, who are the groups of people or countries or people in our country that I have no patience for or talk about, and would love to see consequences, but yet God is gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and He wants to draw that.
Yeah, there's this great irony in that we want a God who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, right? We want this God, but we don't want to share Him, right? We want that. We want
deserve that somehow, but
we want that for us. Yeah, like somehow we deserve that God, but like nobody else should be able to, or just the people that we like. Yeah.
or they're like us.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, like we could spend a whole nother session just talking about like how this story parallels and can kind of like interweave with the story of Jesus, right? With the disciples and Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the Roman rulers, and having like we could do a whole another session there. But we're meant to look at it. I think the Nathan David story is a great example of that. Just to say like, okay, and it's it's why I showed that clip at the beginning, right? It's like we have to make that same choice of, are we gonna hang on to that anger and that bitterness and the resentment and all those different feelings for our enemies, or are we gonna accept who God says He is and then like offer forgiveness the same way that God offers forgiveness, right? Are we gonna model Jesus, who, as He was crucified, says, "Father, forgive them"? Not just a kid's book,
No.
right?
No.
And this is the chapter that often get, like, if you read the kids' versions of Jonah, this chapter gets dumped. Like the kids' books like don't even go here, because this is, this is much deeper than a story about a man being swallowed by a fish or a whale. Yeah.
This is not a Disney story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But it goes back to what we kind of tackled at the very beginning, right? Of like, this is what culture often does to our story. It hijacks it. And part of like what I wanted to show with this is like, our story is so rich and so detailed, and like the Bible is so well written and so nuanced. That like we've got to do this kind of stuff to push past that kind of stuff. But that's the joy of it. That's what we're meant to do in community, is to wrestle with this kind of stuff. Any other parting shots before we finish? 7:01. Thank you guys for going all the way through Jonah with me. That was fun.
Thanks for putting it together.
Yeah,
That was great.
Let me stop this real quick.